Let's continue with Fool Me Twice, Fighting the Assault on Science in America by Shawn Otto. This is Part 2, Yesterday's Science Politics, Chapter 3, Religion Meet Science. As always, the quote, "The value of science to a republican people, the security it gives to liberty by enlightening the minds of its citizens, the protection it affords against foreign power, the virtue it inculcates, the just emulation of the distinction it confers on nations foremost in it, in short, its identification with power, morals, order, and happiness, which merits to it premiums of encouragement rather than repressive taxes, are topics which your petitioners do not permit themselves to urge on the wisdom of Congress, before whose minds these considerations are always present and bearing with their just weight." Thomas Jefferson. In the beginning, to understand the absurd situation America finds itself in, its major challenges largely revolving around science, and yet few in Congress understanding these issues and few media outlets reporting on them, we have to understand what makes the relationship what it is. Has America always been a nation of science? Was it founded as a Christian nation? Has there always been conflicts between religion and science? What exactly are the relationships among science, politics, freedom, and religion in America? Why did science get so advanced here? And most important, why do we keep having conflicts over it? Can democracy and Earth's ecosystem survive them? Contrary to what many fundamentalist politicians and televangelists have claimed, America was not founded as a Christian nation. The land was initially settled by Puritans, true, but the country was founded on the principles of science. In fact, 150 years after the Pilgrims' arrival, the Founding Fathers took great pains to expunge religious thinking from the writings that laid the legal and philosophical foundations for the country they wished to form, beginning with the Declaration of Independence. They carefully carved out a new secular form of government based on limited powers for the authorities and reservation of most freedoms for the people, including freedom of inquiry and expression and freedom of and from religion. The founding documents guaranteed protection of these freedoms and of the people's right to experiment with and modify their government by using an 18th century version of crowdsourcing, and this was something entirely new. It was not coincidental with the scientific revolution, but was rather, as Ferris and others have indicated, the natural outgrowth of it. The liberties these founding principles afforded have in turn produced the highest standard of living, the greatest scientific and technological advances, and the greatest power in the history of the planet. God's natural law is reason. Among the first to seize upon the discovery of the New World were the English merchants of Jamestown, Virginia. When their party of 104 men and boys landed in 1607, they were looking for gold, but instead they wound up growing and selling something even more profitable: tobacco. They were followed some 13 years later by those seeking not fortune, but freedom of religion. The Puritans began to settle Massachusetts as early as 1620, forming fundamentalist enclaves and niches carved out of the savage new continent. They disliked the authority of the Church of England and believed in progress and innovation, that the Bible was God's true law, and that it provided a plan for living. Puritanism wasn't just a theology, it was a whole set of ideas that included taking an anti-authoritarian, experimental, empirical approach to discovering the natural laws by which God's creation abided. In exercising his will, God did not contradict reason. Rather, he revealed himself to humans through two books: the Book of Revelation, made accessible by faith, and the Book of Nature, made accessible by observation and reason. Science was the handmaiden to theology, assisting in the study of the vast library of creation as a vehicle to religious understanding. The idea that God does not contradict reason lies at the foundation of English common law, as first set forth in Christopher St. Germain's 1518 treatise, The Doctor and the Student, which relates a hypothetical conversation between a doctor of divinity and a student of the laws of England and established common law's moral basis. St. Germain was a Protestant polemicist during the reign of King Henry VIII, a time when a great battle was raging between the Catholic Church, which was the highest authority in all matters, and the anti-authoritarian, questioning Protestants who promoted do-it-yourself study of the Bible and nature. In fact, The Doctor and Student was published just a year after Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on a church door. As the reform movement swept through Europe, monks were thrown out of monasteries and told to marry nuns, as Luther did in 1525 when he married an ex-nun. Adherents to Luther's philosophy destroyed and looted the Catholic churches of the bones of their saints and other relics and jewels, condemning the objects as false idols. The truth was to be found in the Bible and a direct experience, they believed, not the pronouncements of the Pope in Rome. This thinking required a re-examination of the world and the devising of a new order based not upon the authority of the Church but upon reason. The question at hand for Saint Germain amid this upheaval was, what be the very grounds of the law of England? He offered first that the law of God underlies reason. The law of God is a certain law given by revelation to a reasonable creature, showing him the will of God, willing that creatures reasonable be bound to do a thing, or not to do it, for obtaining of the felicity eternal. He then declared that reason and natural law are synonymous. As when anything is grounded upon the law of nature, they say, that reason will that such a thing be done, and if it be prohibited by the law of nature, they say it is against reason, or that reason will not suffer that to be done. Therefore, nature was knowable, and God's will could be understood by studying nature to discern its laws. This was a powerful idea that put man into an immediate relationship with God and nature, without an intermediary authority figure. To the Puritans, then, there were no conflicts in the ideas of religion, law, reason, and science. All were varying examinations of natural law. The idea of natural law developed over the next 90 years as Protestantism flourished in England. In 1608, the great English jurist Edward Coke sought to more clearly articulate it in Calvin's case. Coke was a Puritan sympathizer who spent his career working to protect individual liberty and make sure the monarchy's arbitrary authority was circumscribed by the rule of law, an idea that the Puritans very much favored. His report, Calvin's Case, became a foundational document in English law. In it, Coke wrote, "The law of nature is that which God at the time of creation and the nature of man infused into his heart for his preservation and direction." And in an oft-quoted section of his 1628 Institutes of the Laws of England, Coke broadened this idea in an important way that for the first time turned to the crowdsourcing model the American founders would eventually adopt. Seeking to limit the caprice of the royal prerogative, by which the king claimed authority to do whatever he wanted because he was king, Coke argued that natural law motivated individual men, but an infinite number of grave and learned men, working over successions of ages, could refine and protect the laws derived from this initial natural moral basis. Coke called this aggregation artificial reason, which he defined as perfect reason, which commands those things that are proper and necessary, and which prohibits contrary things. Thus, law had a basis in physical reality through the hardwired biological instincts of humans that God had infused into their hearts at the time of their creation. But its full force and power came from socially aggregating those insights. No one man's authority, even the king's, stood above it. This science-friendly Protestant perspective that one could establish law and understand God's will by studying nature, and then over time aggregating and refining a body of knowledge that bound even the king, stood in stark contrast to the position taken by the Roman Catholic Church a few years later, in 1633, when church authorities denied the validity of astronomical science and indicted Galileo for heresy for simply observing nature. The poet John Milton, author of Paradise Lost, is said to have visited Galileo at Arcetri, the hilly area to the south of Florence where he was under house arrest. Milton said that he had been counted by the learned men he met there, happy to be born in such a place of philosophic freedom as they supposed England was. The Inquisition tyrannies of the Church's crackdown in response to Galileo had dampened the glory of Italian wits, that nothing had been there written, now these many years of flattery and fustian. By the end of the 17th century, as Anglican clergy in London were preaching Newton's science, Italian scientists were standing trial in Naples for stating that there had been men before Adam, composed of atoms equal to those of other animals. The DNA of Western thoughts. Each arm of this double helix of Western Christianity, Roman Catholicism and emerging Protestantism, embodied the two distinctly different worldviews of the authoritarian and the anti-authoritarian, that rules and methods were either prescribed from on high or built up by individuals in consensus. These two views had always been present, but they were greatly amplified in 1517, when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses challenging church authorities to debate principles that seemed defensible only by virtue of the church's authority over its subjects. In Luther's view, the church had become corrupt, telling people they could buy their way into heaven by purchasing indulgences, the proceeds of which the church used to finance building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, a legendarily greedy and unethical first-century Roman businessman, Luther asked, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money? Luther's theses split the church between those who clung to authority and tradition and those who believed in man's individual connection to God. Protestantism, with its streak of populist anti-authoritarianism, was born. Luther's grand movements, and the very idea that knowledge could be accessible by individuals without resorting to a conduit provided by an intervening authority, was made possible by a 1451 technological invention, the printing press. For the first time, books could be mass-produced, permitting knowledge and its attendant power to be spread widely. Luther used this new tool to spread power among the people with his 1534 translation of the Bible from Greek, Hebrew, and Latin into Common German. More than 100,000 copies of the Luther Bible were sold within 40 years of its publication, an unfathomable number at the time. And millions heard its message. People could suddenly study the Bible and come to their own conclusions without the intercession of pope or priest. The printing press, by recording and widely distributing knowledge, laid the intellectual foundation for the scientific revolution that was to come. This marks an important moment in human history, when Western thought was split into twin complementary paths that in many ways made the advances of the subsequent 500 years possible. The other three major sources of human power, government, economics, and science, developed similar authoritarian top-down and anti-authoritarian bottom-up strains of thought over the ensuing centuries. In government, as in religion, there are authoritarian, totalitarian models such as monarchy, dictatorship, and fascism on one hand, and anti-authoritarian models like democracy and anarchy on the other. In economics, communism and capitalism are the opposing theories, as are, less extremely, the ideas of John Maynard Keynes about the need for government stewardship of the economy on one hand, and Milton Friedman's laissez-faire free market focus on the other. And in science, the split fell between the two complementary and competing paths of knowledge that were first proposed by the Catholic René Descartes and the Protestant Francis Bacon. The two men's thinking has been combined to underlie what we now call the scientific method. Descartes versus Bacon. Descartes stressed the importance of deduction, a method of reasoning from the top down using first principles, beginning with his famous line, "I think, therefore I am." In his 1637 Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and Seeking Truth in the Sciences, he began by embracing skepticism and approaching the entire world with doubt, free of preconceived notions. There was nothing, he said, he could count on as real if all things were subject to skepticism. Ah, but wait, he was here thinking these thoughts, therefore he must be real. Beginning with his mind as the only reliable foundation, Descartes regarded the senses as unreliable and the sources of untruth and delusion. He concluded that the reliable truth about reality could be determined only by a mind that was separate and distinct from the physical body, thereby originating the concept of the mind-body split, or Cartesian, from Descartes' dualism. To Descartes, the conclusion is valid if and only if it follows logically from the premise, as did the syllogisms in Aristotle's classic book on logic, Organon. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Bacon, in contrast, thought Aristotle had gotten it all wrong, and he stressed nearly the opposite approach. Bacon was a lawyer who worked under the Attorney General Edward Coke, a position he would eventually assume himself. Toward the end of his legal career, he turned more of his attention to science and published what would become a foundational volume, Novum Organum, or New Organon, a devastating attack on Aristotle's book and the logic of the Greeks, with its emphasis on top-down reasoning and disdain for experimentation. In it, he argued instead for using the inductive method of reasoning, which underlies much of the scientific method we use today. Inductive reasoning proceeds from bottom up by observing with the senses and then building in logical steps to reach a general conclusion about reality. An example would be, all observed swans are white. Therefore, all swans are white. This method clearly has a limitation. Its conclusions are provisional and always subject to disproof. All it takes is the discovery of a single non-white swan to invalidate the statement. This is why you hear scientists talking about the theory of evolution. It is not an observed fact, rather it is a conclusion that is supported by all the facts observed so far. But because of the provisional nature of inductive reasoning, scientists hold out the possibility, no matter how small, that it could be invalidated. Science thus demands intellectual honesty, and a scientific conclusion will always contain a provisional statement. All observed swans are white. Therefore, all swans are probably white. In practice, Bacon's method doesn't bother scientists or most reasonable people because the chances of being wrong while present are usually very small. It is, for example, theoretically possible that chemical processes taking place in your body could cause you to spontaneously combust, but we don't live our lives worrying about it because the probability is extremely small. But since we have a limited view of the universe and cannot see everything at once, we cannot make absolute conclusions. That is why math and statistics have become such important parts of science. They quantify the relative probability that a conclusion is true or false. Puritan science. Puritans, rooted as Protestantism was in a protest of Catholic authority, did not take kindly to the indictment of Galileo or to the idea that opinions that were supported as probable by observation of nature, and thus evidence of God's law, could be decreed contrary to Holy Scripture. In fact, the growing conflicts between the Puritans and the Church of England, established in 1534 because the Roman Catholic Church would not annul the marriage of King Henry VIII to Catherine of Aragon, preventing him from marrying again, arose because the Puritans thought the Church of England was not anti-Catholic enough. Thus their name, Puritans. Their frustration led King James in 1604 to authorize a new translation of the Bible, the King James Version, to address their concerns. Nonetheless, many Puritans viewed having a monarch as the spiritual leader of the Church, as is the case with the Church of England, as an irreconcilable compromise, a substitution of king for pope that had been accomplished solely for the matrimonial benefit of Henry VIII. The monarchy's royal prerogative seems to them yet another hypocritical corruption of authority, one akin to the Catholic Church's indulgences. Puritans became even more upset when James's successor, King Charles I, married the French Catholic princess Henrietta Maria within 2 months of his coronation before Parliament could meet to forbid it. Soon after, he began appointing Catholic lords to his court. He appointed William Laud the new Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Laud replaced the wooden communion tables with stone altars, installed railings around them, and ordered the use of candles, causing Puritans to complain that he was altering the Anglican churches to be more Catholic. Laud responded by closing Puritan churches and firing nonconformist clergy. Separatist Congregationalist Puritans began immigrating to America again, fearing a return of Catholic absolutism and partisan political reprisals. Other Puritans organized as dissenters to King Charles's use of arcane laws to levy personal taxes and his aggressive authoritarian power grab. Edward Coke, now in Parliament, sought to limit the bottom-wing king's powers, for example, by serving as chief author to the Petition of Right passed in 1628, which laid out several basic rights that the United States would later adopt. Among these were that taxes could be levied only by Parliament, not by the king, that martial law could not be imposed in peacetime, that prisoners had to be able to challenge the legitimacy of their detentions through writs of habeas corpus, and that soldiers could not be billeted in private residences. But In 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament and asserted personal rule by extended royal prerogative. The state of affairs lasted for 11 years until the English Civil Wars, from 1642 to 1646, and 1648, and from 1650 to 1651, which pitted royalists, authoritarians, against the largely Puritan parliamentarians, anti-authoritarians, and eventually led to both Laud and Charles's beheadings. After the Civil Wars ended and the Church of England was restored, many Puritans broke away. At first these nonconformists were again persecuted, but by the 1660s they were tolerated. Because of their emphasis on individual liberty, their adherents included some of the greatest minds of the age, including Isaac Newton. Newton provides an example of how the idea of science had not yet fully emerged as something separate from religion and early Enlightenment thinking. In fact, during the 17th century, the word scientist was not commonly used to describe experimenters at all. They were called natural philosophers, and an extension of the Puritan idea of the study of the book of nature. Science had also not fully emerged as a separate concept, but was sometimes thought of as a method or style of study, rather than a discretely defined set of disciplines. This was true even into Thomas Jefferson's day. Jefferson himself usually used the word to mean what today we call the hard sciences, but sometimes he used it to refer simply to the rigorous study of other fields, such as the sciences of language, mathematics, and philosophy. By 1663, a time when Puritans were in a decided minority in England, 62% of the natural philosophers in the famed Royal Society of London were Puritans, including Newton, who wrote far more on religion and alchemy than he did on science. Newton believed in the inerrancy of Scripture, biblical prophecy, and that the apocalypse would come in 2060. He was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians, said economist John Maynard Keynes, who purchased a collection of Newton's papers in 1936 and was astounded to find more than 1 million words on alchemy and 4 million on theology, dwarfing his scientific work. Newton went on to create calculus and publish Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, upon which modern physics was founded. 89 years later, Principia was one of the main sources Thomas Jefferson drew upon for inspiration as he sat in the 2 second-story rooms he had rented from Jacob Graff in Philadelphia, writing the Declaration of Independence. The scientist politician. Like Bacon, who famously died of pneumonia after conducting an experiment on preserving meat with snow, Thomas Jefferson was both an accomplished attorney and a scientist. On July 4, 1776, the day the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson took the time to record the local temperature on 4 separate occasions as part of a broader research project he was conducting. His measurements typically also included barometric pressure and wind speed. His goal was to improve meteorological science, to refine farmers' almanacs, and improve weather forecasting throughout the colonies, both of which were of personal importance to Jefferson as a farmer. Jefferson also had knowledge of physics, mechanics, anatomy, architecture, botany, archaeology, paleontology, and civil engineering. He was an avid astronomer. He carried a small telescope with him wherever he went, and recorded the eclipse of 1778 with great precision, although he was frustrated by the cloudy conditions. As president, he commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition. He sold it to Congress as an economic initiative, but he sent his presidential secretary, Meriwether Lewis, for training with the top scientists of the day, and instructed him to conduct it as a scientific expedition. Jefferson's love of science is so well known among students of science policy that many quote him verbatim. "Science is my passion, politics my duty," he said. In writing to a friend just prior to retiring from the presidency of the United States, he said, "Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power. Nature intended me for the tranquil pursuits of science by rendering them my supreme delight, but the enormity of the times in which I have lived has forced me to take part in resisting them, and to commit myself to the boisterous ocean of political passions." Jefferson was also very familiar with Koch, whose institutes he had studied as a law student. This heady mix of science, law, and politics would lead Jefferson to carve out a founding document for the United States that was based not on religion or God, but on knowledge and reason. Whereas religious authority and proximity to God could be endlessly argued between different faiths or countries, Jefferson reasoned that a country that was based on the more narrowly defined rule of men, a democracy, was removed from this religious argument, freeing both religion and the government. He needed to convince the world's nations that American independence should be respected as the only rational and correct state of the world as dictated by the laws of nature. So he had to build the most unassailable argument possible. As his friend and advisor Benjamin Franklin later noted dryly after signing the Declaration Jefferson would craft, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately." Racked by the threat of war, and with its political power resting on uncertain ground, in June of 1776 the Continental Congress appointed Jefferson, along with Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, to secretly draft the documents. The committee delegated the writing of the first drafts to Jefferson. How do we know things? Holed up in his rented rooms, faced with this awesome responsibility, the 33-year-old took up his quill pen. He considered Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke, who he had studied at the College of William and Mary, to be the three most important thinkers of all time. He called them my trinity of the three greatest men in the world had ever produced. Writing on a portable lap desk of his own design, he had labored to create a document that reflected the clear axiomatic logic of John Locke, who instructed that in all sorts of reasoning, every single argument should be managed as a mathematical demonstration, where the connection of ideas must be followed till the mind is brought to the source on which it bottoms. Like Newton and Bacon, Locke was an Englishman and a Protestant, and he is credited with creating the philosophy of empiricism on which much of science is based. He divided human thought into two categories, knowledge and belief. Locke was aware of the many divisions within Christianity, with each faith arguing that it was the one true religion. This was true of not only the great divide between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, but also of lesser divides between German Lutheranism and English Protestantism, and between the Church of England and the Dissenters, the Puritans, and within them the sects of Presbyterians, Separatists, Congregationalists, from whose congregations came the American Pilgrims, and Baptists. Each could not be the one true religion, so some method of ascertaining truth or falsehood had to be developed, or the conflicting claims were likely to go on forever. This led him to ask a fundamental question. How do we know something to be true? What is the basis of knowledge? Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1689, just 2 years after Newton's Principia, strove to lay out what can be known empirically, how it is that we know it, and the inherent limits of knowledge. He began building on Bacon with observation. He then divided knowledge into three types, intuitive, demonstrative, and sensitive. Intuitive knowledge is self-evident to anyone looking at it, and it carries the least doubt of the three types of knowledge. 3 is more than 2, black is not white, and the presence or absence of a thing are examples of intuitive knowledge. Demonstrative knowledge, the second type of knowledge, is slightly less certain than intuitive knowledge. Agreement or disagreement is not immediately clear, but instead depends on the use of reason to demonstrate by necessary consequences as incontestable as those in mathematics that something is so. Each step in a reasoning process, which, as Saint Germain had described, was the process of discovering the natural law of things, must in and of itself be intuitively evident. For example, a feather falls in air more slowly than a penny does. When we remove the air with a vacuum pump, the feather and the penny fall at the same rates. Therefore, air changes how gravity acts on different objects. These intermediate steps of reasoning are called proofs. Each conclusion is reliable because it is ultimately traceable, step by demonstrable step, back to the foundation of the natural world. Locke called the third kind of knowledge sensitive knowledge, meaning that we get it directly from our senses. For example, we become aware of a rose by its scent, then look for its presence. But in a nod to Descartes, he acknowledged that our senses are often wrong. Sometimes it's not a rose we smell, but perfume. Sometimes we see not a pond, but a mirage. Locke argued that sensitive knowledge is thus much less certain than intuitive or demonstrative knowledge. Finally, he said, whatever comes short of one of these, with what assurance soever embraced, is but faith or opinion, but not knowledge, at least in all general truths. The progeny. This was critical to Jefferson because it laid the foundational argument for democracy, which was implicit in a different form in Coke's argument for the primacy of English common law. If we discover the truth by using reason, which according to St. Germain and Koch is driven by God's will, then anyone can discover the truth, and therefore no one is naturally better able or more entitled to discover the truth than anyone else. Because of this, political leaders and others in positions of authority do not have the right to impose their beliefs on other people. The people themselves by natural law retain this inalienable right. Based on Locke's ideas of knowledge and Koch's ideas of law, this anti-authoritarian equality of all men and their ability to use reason to discern the truth for themselves is logically self-evident. It is intuitive knowledge, and that's the heart of America. Jefferson worked diligently for days to craft a document that was grand and yet achieved the unassailable quality of logical proof. The axiomatic beauty of the argument he was reaching for would indelibly tie science, knowledge, freedom, and democracy together in a single common cause of human advancement and proclaim the inalienable right of the people to reject authoritarian tyranny as illegitimate. But in spite of his best intentions, in his rough draft, Jefferson founded on the shoals of authoritarian religious assumptions left over from Hobbes's bleak and brutal post-Middle Ages, a fact that illustrates how deeply rooted these assumptions are, even for scientists like Jefferson, and how slow and careful a process is required to tease out what is knowledge from what, and to quote Locke, is but faith or opinion. The misstep occurred in the opening of the second paragraph, when Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal." When Jefferson showed his draft to Franklin, Franklin made several firm, bold backslashes, striking the words sacred and undeniable, and drawing on Locke's, whom he too admired, he replaced Jefferson's reference to divine authority with the anti-authoritarian words self-evident that Locke had used in Essay. The idea of a supreme being infinite in power, goodness, and wisdom, whose workmanship we are, and on whom we depend, and the idea of ourselves as understanding rational beings, being such as are clear in us, would, I suppose, if duly considered and purified, afford such foundations of our duty and rules of action as might place morality amongst the science capable of demonstration, wherein I doubt not, but from self-evident propositions, by necessary consequences as incontestable as those in mathematics, the measures of right and wrong might be made out to any one that will apply himself with the same indifference and attention to the one as he does to the other of the sciences. Franklin's edit, it may be argued, helped to make the United States into the scientific and technological powerhouse it became. At the time America's most renowned scientists, Franklin was also an admirer of Newton's Principia and a friend of the Scottish economist David Hume. Hume had written extensively on natural law and liberty, which Jefferson had drawn on in the sentence, and he defined liberty as freedom of choice. By liberty, then, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting, according to the determinations of the will. This is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. Even though Newton did not see a conflict between science and religion, neither did he insist upon applying religious thinking to the realm of science, which is the realm of understanding, as he put it, or knowledge, versus but faith or opinion. A man may imagine things that are false, Newton said, but he can only understand things that are true. Newton and Hume both instead rested their arguments on empiricism, bottoming them out in the natural world with evidence, and so it had to be with argument for liberty. Hume argued that whatever definition we may give of liberty, we should be careful to observe two requisite circumstances. First, that it be consistent with plain matter of fact. Secondly, that it be consistent with itself. If we observe these circumstances and render our definition intelligible, I am persuaded that all mankind will be found of one opinion with regard to it. This is the persuasive power that Jefferson was reaching for by trying his arguments back to the plain matter of facts laid bare by his venerated Trinity and the aggregated authority of grave and learned men in English common law, as established by Koch. Franklin understood that Jefferson's words had inadvertently confused the realms of knowledge and faith, resting the principle being argued that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, on an authoritarian religious assertion, which, as Locke himself had shown, could be argued indefinitely. It was therefore weak as a political argument, a matter of mere belief rather than knowledge or evidence-based. Franklin knew Jefferson was reaching for something more powerful, something that all mankind will be found of one opinion with regard to it, and he knew how to take it there. He instead rested the principle on reason and Locke's intuitive knowledge, moving the founding argument for the United States firmly out of the realm of an assertion of religious authority as unsacred and undeniable, i.e. God is on our side, or God save the monarchy, and into the realm of man, reason, and the laws of nature that flowed from empiricism, anti-authoritarianism, and nature itself. It was self-evident. In the process, they created something entirely new, a nation that respected and tolerated religion in every sense, but did not base its authority on religion. A nation whose governance was instead based on the underlying principles of liberty, reason, and science. That's the end of Chapter 3. Next week we will read Chapter 4, Science Meet Freedom.